Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of A Contagious Smile, where every smile tells a story. I am so excited. I've been trying to get with this amazing woman for a while now, but as everybody knows, with Faith being sick, I had to postpone quite a few interviews, and I do apologize for the inconvenience that caused. But we have Dr. Catherine Cleveland with us today. She's amazing. Wait until you hear all of the wonderful things about this woman. I can't even do a justifiable bio on her. I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about her. I tried to put something together for her about her bio, and I just was like, I could talk about just who she is for the entire show. I'm going to let her tell you about her. Dr. Cleveland, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I'm so grateful to be here to speak with your audience. Please call me Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine. So tell us a little bit about you, because I literally could spend a good hour just over everything you've accomplished and everything you do.
Well, to give you a brief background, I was married to a fifth generation dairy farmer and rural community member. And in my mid 40s, he had died of brain cancer. And then I went back to school to start a second career and got into mental health counseling and into the master's and PhD program. And then got into opening my own private practice. And one of my jobs also is to help residents that graduate from graduate level programs in mental health get into their own private practice. So it's a residency program. As far as I know, it's the only one in the world that we do this, because it's specific to get you into learning the business end of it. And then, working with my own practice and my own community, you see a lot of common things with people, because we always think we come in and people have really unique, different situations and problems, which they do, but there's a lot of commonness between human behavior. And I thought it was very important to share that, because people feel so isolated and alone in their problems. And if we could really see how are we similar in what happens in human behavior? So I started to take the most common things that I talk about in my practice, what I talk about with all of my patients for many years, and started to write books about them. But they're not just books where you just read, they're interactive books. So there's some coloring, there's some writing, there's writing prompts. It gets you really thinking very deeply. It does some insightful work. So it's almost like counseling a little bit without the counselor, but it also aids with a lot of counselors use this book to help get some ideas and education with their patients. So that's what I've been doing. I've got 2 books published and I'm working on my third. So that's where I'm at.
Catherine, tell us the name of the books you're referring to. So we'll talk about them more in detail later, but what are the names of the 2 books you already have out?
So it's going to be a 3, maybe 4-part series. And the first book is called The 4 Essential Pillars of Boundary Setting. And this is their practice-informed guides that on the front, it says that elevate your empowerment, your authenticity, and most importantly, your self-worth. So it's those are the things that we feel like, how can we be our authentic selves? And then, when we're always trying to work with some difficult relationships, and then also how can we look and see our own self-worth and value that. The other book that just came out is Cultivating Gratitude, Gratefulness, and Graciousness. Same thing. It's really practice informed. In other words, we take theories that are psychology theories, and then we run them through the practice to see if they actually work and they actually help people. And again, to become your authentic self, to feel like you're empowered, and also work on the healing that you may need for whatever is going on in your personal life. The third one that's coming out is called Kinder to Myself, because that's very common when I see people that are really struggling, is that they're pretty hard on themselves. They're not very nice. And that is just mind-blowing when we start to point that out. So I really like talking about that. How can we be kinder and treat ourselves better? So those are the 3 parts.
I am so excited. I actually cannot wait to read all 3 of them. But what is really interesting is I've been doing a lot of work about narcissism here lately and talking with a lot of people about narcissistic behavior. And myself and another wonderful lady, Dana Diaz, also, who's been co-hosting with me, is talking about the fact that when you grow up in a narcissistic environment, that you're pretty much, being trained to what to go to. And that's where you end up. And like Dana and I both ended up in really bad marriages that were violent and, to say the least. And it's all stemming back from narcissistic behavior. And, a lot of people say, well, they had a bad childhood. Well, so did we, but we broke the cycle. And
Yes.
it's about the fact that, like, a lot of people, Catherine, don't want to do the work. And the ones that should be on the couch never think they need to be on the couch. They don't want to go and get counseling and get help because A, they don't own up to anything they've ever done, and they don't
Yep.
think that there's anything wrong with them.
Yes, absolutely. It's so interesting that we really don't understand narcissist behaviors. And there's a lot of signs that we can see about, like, okay, why is that person the one that needs to come and see the counselor, the therapist? And sometimes they actually do, and they do it to use it to say, see, I did that, and they can also, some of them are so gifted at it, if the counselor or whoever is working with them isn't really well trained in these personality disorders, because that we call them a cluster B personality disorders, which there's 4 different ones, and it all kind of circles that narcissistic, is that if we don't recognize it, we're actually teaching them how to be better at what they do. So that we have to be very careful. So with the supervision that I do, I teach a course at the University of Rochester, and we're very careful about pointing this out so we can recognize it when they're coming in the door. Because when we help narcissists that are really, like, really, if you look at it on a spectrum, they're like higher up, like 5 or higher, that we're making them worse.
How do you recognize when you have a narcissist in front of you? How do you
Oh,
see it?
that is such a great question. So there's a lot to it. In the boundary setting book, there's a page on it, and it's not to really get into the details of what narcissism is, because it's about teaching the reader how to set boundaries with anybody in their relationship, so they just are healthier. But really, the first thing that we'll notice is that they can make us feel bad when we have done nothing wrong. That is a red flag right there. Why? I've done nothing wrong and you're making me feel bad. But we kind of tune that out, because some of us are just like, we may be people pleasers. We may just we're kind, we're nice, we want to, like, just be in a relationship and make things work out. So we
Right.
kind of tune out to our own authenticity, and we tune out of our own intuition. So that's it, is like, pay attention to, like, if someone's making you feel bad, it doesn't have to be a person in a relationship. It could be someone like a work colleague or a boss. It could be in any relationship. Another one that's really important, and this I actually catch people doing it. I'll explain it, then I'll hear them doing it. I say, oh, there it is. And then they're like, oh my God. We try to use logic to explain somebody else's behavior. So a person that's not narcissistic, or not on that high of a scale, that does not have a personality disorder, right, will
Right.
be like, oh my God, I can't believe this. Why are you doing this? This doesn't make sense. Like, why would that person do this? It just doesn't make sense. So when you find yourself trying to use logic and what they're doing doesn't make sense, and you're like racking your brain going, why, and you see yourself doing that. Now there's more to this, because it keeps going. All
Uh,
right. So if you're not in a intimate romantic relationship, then it goes even deeper. So if it's a work colleague, you're like just shaking your head. That just doesn't make sense. So that's a really good sign. Let me repeat that, is you're trying to explain their behavior with logic. You cannot. Logic, that's why it's a personality disorder. I don't really like that term
I don't
across
either.
the board. I don't. But in this situation, it really does kind of fit. But because it just doesn't make sense what their behaviors and their actions are, and you just can't explain it. Okay, so this is what we do next. So now we're with somebody, then all of a sudden we start to explain to them what they're doing wrong. That's the problem, because we're explaining something they already know. And we're explaining to an adult their behavior and their emotions and their actions. They already know. They just don't care. They like it when you do that. That's one of the reasons why they act in the way that they do, because of the reaction. They get a reaction from negative reaction, you're explaining like how did you do that? How many times have I told you this? So if you find another way to look at it is you find like you're almost parenting them by teaching them what's wrong with their behaviors. So if
Yes.
you're doing that, that's when we have to kind of like pull back and say, oh God, no, this is it. They're sucking me in. They're sucking me in. And this can go on for years. And we just get frustrated, and they're playing us. It's a type of manipulation. So watch out for that explanation. When you start explaining their behaviors or lack of behaviors or lack of empathy to them, they're adults, they know what they're doing. Okay. The other thing that you guys probably have talked about is watching out when you're starting in a relationship of looking for love bombing or sex bombing. Okay, so it's really nice. You meet a really charming person. And for me, it would be a guy that would come up and they just tell you all the things you want to hear. And it feels so
Yes.
good, especially those of us who grew up with like in traumatic environments or unhealthy environments or unsupported environments from parents for whatever reasons. And so whenever we get some kind of like really wonderful like validation, praise, and we believe it because they are so good at it, remember, they're master manipulators, and we fall for it. So that might be love bombing. That happens not always, but typically with men towards women. Okay. It also can happen in same-sex relationships. It's not always heterosexual relationships, but it's just what you want to watch out. Everyone's situation is unique. In with men, and I've heard this with a lot of men that I've worked with as patients, it's called the sex bombing, where the women just like within the second date or so, the sex just comes on full force and they just have sex and sex and sex for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the guy is all involved and sucked in, then all of a sudden that ends. And then the behavior and the actions and the personality that we can't explain start to come out. And I can hear them say, and then she did this, and I can't even believe it. And then she did that. And, they're sleeping with their best friends. It's just all this behavior starts coming out that was hidden, and you got drawn in from sex. So there's sex bombing and there's love bombing. But if you can really see those key things coming up, like the sex bombing, love bombing happening early in the relationship, if it's too good to be true, yeah, the saying that it is. And then watch out for, why am I feeling bad? You're making me feel bad when I've done nothing wrong. And then the other one is watch out for that explaining. It's a really hard one to stop. The other one too, one more is, we may have expectations of them to behave differently, like, in a more healthy, non-personality disorder manner.
Right.
Wow. And that letting go of those expectations is quite a relief too, because it just likely isn't going to happen. It doesn't mean that they can't get help and that they can't get changed, but statistically, they really don't want to. They're too afraid to change. And we can talk about that too, but that's a lot of information. I hope you find that like interesting and helpful.
Absolutely, 1,000,000%. But I'm going to throw you a curveball. What about narcissistic parents and narcissistic grandparents?
Yeah, that's a whole nother story. That is like, I'm looking at it more of that you're in this relationship with them. And that's where we have to really start to look at, as young people, you just don't know. You grow up in this, you don't know. And then you're like, don't realize that that's not normal. So you're the one who's breaking the cycle when you go to get help. So then we have to kind of like reparent a little bit, where you start to reparent yourself from a healthier way. And that takes a long time. So if this is a situation that you're in, please be patient with it, because you know nothing else. Now, if you're still in a relationship, even as an adult, where, they're your family and you want to kind of have some kind of a connection with them, there's boundaries. If you don't have boundaries set with them, then you're actually just keeping yourself upset and angry. And that's also something that a lot of people don't understand, what actual boundary setting is and how it works. So I wanted to get that out in the book so you could actually figure it out. And it's the writing part of it allows you to put in your own unique situation so you can see it from that perspective, which is important, that we recognize that everyone has their own situation, not one size fits all with this.
Absolutely, Catherine. I couldn't agree more with that. But for instance, in like, let's take my situation. I was raised by a narcissist who absolutely did not even know the definition of boundary respecting. And when my daughter, has special needs, they absolutely did not respect my boundaries when it came to her. And that was
Mhm.
a really big thing, especially being medically, fragile at that point. But I get to talk with a lot of amazing kids and teens, and I do a lot of work with kids and teens, and we even have a podcast just for teens where their voice feels valued and they're heard and they get to talk unconditionally. And even if they're with a panel and they don't agree at the end, we do like like almost like a game where everybody agrees and we say, you know what? Everybody has an opinion and it's not always going to be in your favor, but we're still respecting each other at the end of the day. And it's really important that they feel that way because a lot of them today don't feel that they have that respect anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important to understand that we really do to learn more about human behavior is to see it from different people's perspectives. And when we're coming up through some kind of an abusive relationship in childhood or in a current relationship with somebody, and we get out of this is and get out of these relationships, and we're the ones who are brave enough. It takes a lot of courage, and the great Brene Brown says you cannot be courageous and comfortable at the same time. So it takes a lot of discomfort to face yourself and to step up, and takes a lot of courage to see and own all of this stuff that's happened to you. It's not necessarily you think something is wrong with you. And there's a book by Bruce Perry, and it says it's not it's not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And when we really, the courage part is to step back and to really look at it and own it, because once we see clearly like everything that's happened to us, and for whatever reason, whatever trauma that's going on at any stage of your life, that's when we can really start to do something with it. And the greatest thing is that no one understands another person as well as someone who has been traumatized. The people who have harmed us the most can be some of our best educators. I was in an abusive relationship after my husband passed away. A few years later, I got into a bit of a long-term relationship. It was not physical, but it was an emotional relationship, and got out of it. It was really scary to get out of that relationship. Another thing is that when you set boundaries with people that are not receptive to them, and we'll talk about how to do that a little bit if you'd like, but is
Love
that
to.
they escalate. And I always warn
Yes.
people, if you say no or you put this boundary in place, they are going to get worse. They are going to escalate. You have to prepare for that. And that did happen to me. So you take someone who's not physically abusive, and then you put the boundary in and you say, okay, I'm leaving, I'm out. We were separated, and then he broke into my house and put his hands around my throat. Luckily, we got that in taken care of. He ended up in jail for too short of a time. Order of protections, I know that doesn't always work. I understand all of this, but to really to see like what did that teach me? Oh my God, that has taught me so much. So it's the perspective I'm taking. I'm not trying to ruminate about it. I'm not, I was angry for a really long time. I wanted to get past that, to become more indifferent, and then have someone that comes to see me, as a patient. They come in and I'm like, yeah, I get it. So it's called the Me Too effect,
Mhm.
understanding that. There's a little bit of that in this book here.
The
And
gratitude book.
yeah, the gratitude book, it's wonderful, because if you're been hurt in any way, and you can sit with somebody that gets it because they've been hurt too. So I'm sorry that none of this should happen to anybody, but we can use it to help others. We can use it to understand, because other people just don't get the depth of what
Right.
you're going through. So I think, thank you. Yeah, for great question.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you're out of that, by the way. And I am so sorry about Carl passing. But I also wanted to say, when I sit down with these women, and I love these women, I just hate the circumstance of how we meet, is the fact that I tell them, they're like, well, I've heard about the fact you had all these surgeries. And I'm like, one hit, one kick, one punch is one too many. This is not a competition
Yeah.
by any means. If they put their hands on you once, it's too much. And
Right.
I get it and understand it. And we're going to talk about it. Like, it's not a competition between us women or men or whoever is on that side. And you know what? We're survivors because we survived them. And at the end of the day, they're still their ugly, non-socially acceptable selves, right? And it's
Yeah, the best revenge is happy life.
absolutely a million percent. So, can you give us some insight on the boundaries? How do we create
Absolutely.
them?
Yeah, so we're looking for some empowerment here because it's been
Yes.
crushed out of us, maybe from early childhood, maybe from an adult relationship, teen relationship at any age. It's just been crushed out of us. They are so good at crushing our self-worth. So this is what we're doing is we're trying to find ourselves, our authentic self, and that's just gone. It's been buried, but it is also still there. It is there. We just kind of have to kind of go excavate and go in deep and find it and bring that out and find the strengths and find everything. And a lot of people really don't always believe that it's there inside of them. And I know it is. It's there inside all of us. So there's 4 pillars that I arranged this book in. Okay. And the number one is like, well, the first question, not the first pillar, is like, why are you here? What brings you here? Why is this important? So you really think about the meat of it starts with pillar 1 is your values. Okay. So you start with, it's really hard to set a boundary with another person if you don't know what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. That's your values. What am I okay with and what am I not okay with? So it's more than not okay with. And if we don't know that clearly, like I am not okay with you yelling at me and I've done nothing wrong, that would be a boundary. I am not okay with you cheating on me. That would be a boundary. With a parent, like I had one woman that was her mother-in-law was trying to parent their children, coming and running the show. So there's all different situations. As many as there are people, there's different situations. So whatever it is, when one person is interfering with your well-being, then we have to know, what are my values? If you aren't clear about that, the best thing to do is write it down. Because when you write it down, it takes thought, it puts it into language, and then it puts it on paper so you can see it. So it's working many parts of the brain. And then all of a sudden more things start to come up. You're like, oh my God, I didn't even think of this. Oh my God, I didn't even think of that. And all of a sudden you're like, wow, this is great. I've got all these values. Now, values are your personal values. Sometimes values are family values, but they're both. And values are, some of them are pretty much set in concrete for most of your life, but as we age and we change, we might put some more in and take some out. So they are flexible also. I have a great example. I had a guy that working with his teenage daughters was working through the book. And when she got into that section, he realized that he didn't have good boundaries with his employees. So he had a really bad turnover and they were kind of like taking advantage of the business situation. And he came in and the light bulb went off. So the writing really helps. So that's important. Start there. So a lot of people, what they try to do is they try to go and set the boundary with the other person, but they're not really clear that this is not okay with me, or this is what I want in my life. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is the actual setting of the boundary. Okay. And this is where we get a little confused too, is that we take the values and we say, okay, it's pretty easy to figure out the boundary setting. So then you're like, okay, this is the person. I can give an example. Like if you hit me, one and done, that might be a boundary right there. All right. So we think that the person we're setting the boundary with crosses the boundary. They don't. We do. We got to understand that the boundary is not for them. It is for us. So if the boundary gets crossed, we're the ones crossing the boundary. That's important because a lot of times, like you'll say, oh, I was trying to set this boundary with my mother and she keeps pushing it and pushing it and it's just not working. All right. Why is it not working? Okay, because the boundary is not for her, it's for you, and you are letting that happen. So like you're saying, is like, it's not a competition, you know. For me, the boundary is hit me once and I'm out. That's it, one and done. Now if I stay and you hit me again, I've crossed my own boundary. So then it's not even a boundary to begin with. We don't have it there. So we're like, you're crossing my boundary, you shouldn't hit me. No, 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 I'm choosing to stay. Okay, so that's the boundary, is the pillar number 2. So now another thing to keep this boundary in place is when we get into the whole section of consequences. All boundaries must have consequences. If then I'm talking about boundaries, interpersonal boundaries, that means between you and another people. It could be a boss, it could be a workmate, any other person. There's also in this book that we can talk about later about interpersonal boundaries. Those are for between you and the relationship that you have with yourself. We can talk about that more if you'd like. But the interpersonal boundaries is what we're focusing on right now. And with interpersonal boundaries, we need to have consequences. All right. So for example, if you do this, fill in the blank, here is the consequence. Now you get to decide on the consequences. These are your values. These are your boundaries, and these are your consequences. This is not for anybody to tell you how to run your life. It's from your life and your values and your culture, whatever that looks like. Mm-hmm. So the consequence, for example, is like, if you hit me, I am leaving you. That's pretty good match. Okay. All right. If the consequences, look, my bedtime's at 10 o'clock and could you stop calling me? If you don't stop calling me, then I'm ending our relationship. That sounds a little odd. It could be, maybe the boundary is I need to turn my phone off, or whatever you want to do, to stop that from happening. Now I know people are pushing your boundaries, and I know that we can't always put these consequences in place, especially when we're afraid for our life. I understand that. This is like, if I put this boundary in with him, he'll kill me. I get that. But then we have to look at the bigger picture. How can we get into a place where we're safe, where we can start to put these boundaries in place? And that's going to take time, but we still have to not dismiss our values and our self-worth so we can get to that point. All right. And then the last section talks about where we sabotage all of this, how the emotions get in the way. There's a bunch of them in there, but the biggest ones, 2 of them, are guilt and shame. And if you're a Brene Brown fan, you know all of this. The guilt is, I am doing something wrong. And you're shaking your head. And then the shame is, I don't think very highly of myself. It's low self-worth. Yes. So those are the things that we want to build up, so then we can maintain these boundaries and these consequences. So that's kind of the gist of this book. It's step by step laid out. And it really was designed specifically so you could see it from your perspective.
I cannot wait to read this book. I have a lot of people who ask me, and I would love your insight on it. How does, for instance, you have somebody who's a narcissist and they have fantastic parents. They have wonderful parents. How do they become a narcissist?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because we don't really know specifically whether there's some, like, what they would call brain damage or neurodiversity. We don't know for sure. Mm-hmm. We can't really look at a child's brain when they're born and say, oh, nice baby, can we study their brain? Right. No, you want to love your child, and we can't really do research on what's going on in the brain. But if you look at anybody that has some differences on any spectrum, because narcissism is a spectrum, is there something in their brain that we just can't see or that we don't know? And we're trying to explain that with logic. If you look at someone who's on the autism spectrum, we accept that. It is, we work with it. We don't say, oh, you need to change and be like the rest of us, because that's just not how their brain is wired. So maybe their brains are wired. There are books that talk about this, about, are they born this way, or are they developed this way? Or does it, usually there's a part of the brain that's called the amygdala, right? And it's in the center part of the brain in the limbic system. And one of the things that we can see is that tends to be a little bit smaller than someone who isn't a narcissist. So their empathy is lacking. Their ability for remorse is lacking or non-existent. And that is other parts of the brain contributed to that. We really don't know. Like, we can't always say it's just one part. But we have seen in research that that tends to be smaller. Now, we don't know if that just didn't develop properly or because of the social environment. I mean, you think of someone who grows up in a neighborhood that's really strong gang oriented, they're just trained from day one, or even terrorists day one, just to
Sure.
not have empathy. Why is it that this person, so we're lacking empathy, meaning that knowing what it's like, there's many definitions of it. One of my favorites is knowing what it's like to being on the receiving end of this. And I actually said that to my abuser. And I said, do you know what it's like to be on the receiving end of this? And that was the one time he didn't like blow up and just turn it into some big drama. He goes, I have no idea. It was like the most refreshing, honest thing he said to me. I have no idea. And I wasn't the only one that he had behavioral problems with, and and I was like, wow, that was like the most refreshing thing that you've ever said to me. So they don't really care, or maybe they do know, I don't know. So we don't know. It's usually some kind of environmental thing that is bringing it up. So there's all sorts of reasons. And
Right.
maybe the parents are more narcissistic and they hide it and you don't know it.
Well, let me play devil's advocate. What about when people say, well, it's not really their fault that they're a narcissist? So does that mean that we should give them a pass? Because I can't give somebody a pass because, like, if you're being the black sheep, you didn't ask to be the black sheep. You're not asked to be raised in that environment. You grow up in an environment with a narcissist who only uses you for their own manipulative gain. And then people say, well, maybe it's not their fault that they're this way. Maybe they had a bad childhood or whatever the case is. But if we can break the cycle, how come they can't contain themselves? And why do we have to give them a pass? And then, like, we have to live with it for the rest of our lives. We have to deal with all the trauma recorrection and recovery the
Yeah,
rest of our lives. And people feel bad for the ones who caused it.
I agree with you absolutely, Victoria, because it is everything we do, as long as we are of sound mind, reasonably sound mind, that intellectually sound, I should say, not necessarily emotionally sound, because these are not emotionally sound people, is that everything we do is with an intention. Even if there's not an intention, there's an intention there. And even those of us who have grown up in some pretty bad childhood raising, we still know how to feel bad. We still know how to have some kind of empathy. We can develop that.
Mhm.
Again, it's still a choice, because if someone who is a severe narcissist on pretty high, they're going to be in prison. I mean, prison for life, because they're going to keep getting in trouble and keep getting caught. And maybe they can't change, and maybe they just don't want to change. Again, these are things that we don't quite understand, but we do know that working with high, like this high scale of like psychopathy that score pretty high on that test, really have no desire to change. And they'll tell you that this is the way it is. They can't see the world in any other way. They can't see it the way we see it. So, but the people that aren't quite that bad, it's still a choice. I agree, it's still a choice. But one of the reasons I believe is that if I stop behaving this way, everyone's going to get me. It's almost like a wall of protection. If I hurt you and get you, then you can't hurt and get me. So that's why they can't let their guard down. So that would be my abuser. Was I knew that his guard was he was good in a lot of ways. So they're not all bad. We do know that, as long as you're not even talking about serial killers, the neighbors always said, oh, he's such a nice guy. I can't even imagine that. So, there's parts of them that are good, and that's what we're always trying to grasp onto, and then ignore the part that's really dangerous and harmful. But it's just, if I let that wall down, then I'm vulnerable, and they can't be vulnerable like you and I can be vulnerable. Change takes vulnerability. That means we have to see it. we have to own it, and we have to speak it safely. You come to a counselor, tell your truth. This right here, this podcast alone is just allowing people to hear other people tell their truth. It's so important. So those of us who are healing from this have the courage. We're actually stronger than they are because we can speak our truth.
Yeah.
They think of it as a fear-based lifestyle. Everything they do is based in fear. We
What
think
a
it's,
great way to look at that.
yeah, think about that for a minute.
Right.
Everything they do, if I'm attacking you verbally and I'm like abusing you, I'm abusing your time. You know, another great sign of abuse is people that abuse your time. If they say I'll be there at 4 and they show up at 5, and people don't know that time abuse is a type of abuse. It is abuse.
Yes.
So watch out for that one. That's what his mind did. He did that. He'd show up 2 hours late for everything, and then if you called him out on it, he'd just lose his shit. You know, so we have to be really careful about that. But knowing that everything they do is in fear, everything.
So how does because I get a lot of teens and they ask these questions. I would love your perspective on it. How does a narcissist pick who's going to be the black sheep and who's going to be the golden child?
The narcissist pick of like, as far as ask me that question again so I'm clear, like how they're picking somebody or
Right, like
or...
the parents, if you have two narcissistic parents and you have two
Okay.
children, how do they decide, okay, you're going to be the black sheep and I'm going to blame everything that you have nothing to do with on you. You're going to get ridiculed and blamed for everything. And you're going to be the golden child. And the spectrum is night and day between the siblings. They don't get to speak to each other because it's like they're puppets and the parents are holding the strings. So how does the narcissist pick who is going to be in what role for them? How do they come up with that?
Well, if you're talking about like parents and young people, it's really like, how does the child present? So if you have a very happy child and they're kind of bubbly, or if you have a child that maybe has, isn't feeling that great and they're just a little bit not as happy, they're going to pick based on the child's personality, what they can manipulate. And they're not even consciously aware that they're doing that. Here's an example. I have a brother that was just brilliant in school, just did wonderfully, not that my other siblings didn't, but he just had a gift that other people didn't have. So they saw that really clearly. And that was it. He was the golden child, literally the golden child. And actually, believe it or not, that messed him up because they never really saw him for who he was. And they never, because it's like, they put him out into Ivy League schools and everything, instead of just letting him just be the kid. He was always the golden child. So those expectations on him never just, I have to meet this all the time. That was really hard on him. For myself, who just didn't quite fit the mold of what a young woman should be many, many years ago. And I didn't, I was kind of athletic. I like to do what I like to do. I didn't want to follow the herd. And my parents wanted me to get married and have children because that's what you do. And I was like, no, and just wanted to do my own thing. So they treated me completely differently. They treated me like I wasn't smart, or, they were just like, just, you're just going to have to figure it out for your own, and kind of left me out there. Now that made me also very strong. It's not all bad.
Right. Absolutely.
But with a person looking for a victim for an intimate relationship, or even in business where you have somebody in your office, they're looking for someone with their body language. So body language is something we talk about a lot in my practice, and some of the work I do in public speaking is, if you have low self-worth, like you don't think highly of yourself, you're going to get that back. What we put out into the universe, what we've learned, comes back to us. So if I'm an angry person, I'm going to get an angry person. If I don't think highly of myself, I'm going to get someone who doesn't treat me very well, because it's like they can see it in your body language. So for example, if you're thinking about this right now, and where are your shoulders? When you're walking, it's one thing when you're home relaxing on the couch watching a movie, but when you're walking through the grocery store, what is your body language? Are your shoulders rounded forward, right? Mm-hmm. And is your head down a little bit? Are you kind of closed off? And then they can look at you and see that. Or is your chest up as your kind of shoulder blades pinch them together a little bit, and then look up and look at people in the eye. That just physically shows confidence. And I don't want to mess with that, because you're not the wounded, injured one. You have self-worth and self-confidence. So I'm not going to go near that. So they try to go after the person that doesn't feel very highly about themselves. Now, I don't want you to say, what's wrong with me, because this is how, especially women, how we're brought up. It's like, you can't have an opinion. That's if you are assertive and you stand your ground, then you're aggressive. You've been called every name in the book, right?
Yeah.
So we have all these negative labels for women, that we have 2 or 3 for men. We have thousands for women, to push you down, push you down, push you down, and keep you in your place. Our culture does it. Our parents do it, everything. It's generational. We're not looking at blame here. And so now we're finally in a place where women can make their own money, own their own house, pay their own bills, raise their kids, do it all on their own, it's sad. I hate to see that happen. But those labels don't work on us anymore. You can call me everything. And if you look too pretty, all of a sudden you got called really negative words. We just don't care. We don't care. It doesn't matter. Those things bounce right off us. So the world is changing, where we are trying to be really good role models for all people, no matter what. Start with body language. So here's a really interesting thing. We looked at a study where, I can't remember what prison it was in California. So you've got the elite of like the personality disorders that are just no remorse. And they're watching this videotape, this is many years ago, of students crossing the road, very, very busy, from the university center to their cars. And I think this was pre-phone, so they weren't really staring at their phones a lot. But so the prisoners were told they wouldn't get in any trouble. They could say whatever they wanted. It wouldn't go against them. Who would you pick? What would you do to them, and why? And they did it solely on body language.
Really?
Yeah. Yep. And looking at this is the person, this is why. It just came to them naturally like that. So for me, I think if you have a lot of shame and not good thoughts about yourself, your body language is going to represent that. Now, that's not something that's easy to change all of a sudden one day. I'm like, oh, I'm fine. My self-worth is fine. This takes years and lifelong practice to rebuild this.
Yes.
It is. Yeah. Think of it as being in training,
Yes.
And think of it, you don't just all of a sudden decide to run a marathon. You have to train for it. And it's a lifelong practice, and it's kind of very satisfying. It's very empowering, but it definitely isn't going to change if the body language doesn't change. So keep an eye on that in yourself, and practice it in the grocery store. It's the best place to do it.
Yeah. Your books, the mental health books, they're aimed at finding seekers of happiness. You're trying to help them see. I tell people all the time, even if you think your light isn't flickering anymore, it still is. It's still flickering, and you know what? It could start a wildfire. You just have to find it. And it sounds like these are what your books are looking for, is to help ignite that wildfire within everybody.
Yeah.
So you just want to help all these other people. What inspired you to start writing these workbooks that can help so many people?
Yeah, it's just, I hear the same things over and over and over again from people, the low self-worth,
Yes.
and not kind to yourselves, and not being able to have a healthy relationship with somebody you love that may be abusing you or crossing some boundaries. It doesn't always have to be extreme. Like, I really love my mom and everything, but this one thing drives me crazy. And what that does is, if we don't kind of put in these boundaries and see our self-worth and think kindly and be kind to ourselves, then we spend a lot of time being angry.
Yes.
And we're upset with that person all the time. I don't want to be upset with the people in my life. I don't want to be upset with anybody. So if I'm upset with you, it's because I need to pull back and say, what's going on here? What's important to me? And then I want to put that in place. So this is so common. The Cultivating Gratitude book and graciousness really talks about a lot of things that we've lost. We can start a gratitude journal. That's great. But this goes into depth about like what we're doing that's causing us some really harmful energy. So one of the things is you can see where people get really energized when they're gossiping, when they're angry, when they're explosive, when they're being self-righteous, when they're gaslighting. That's what we call a really unhealthy energy, because you're energized from it.
Right.
And then there's the healthy energies, which is when we're doing something to accomplish something that takes effort. So like maybe you're starting an exercise program that takes effort. Maybe you're going to school that takes effort. Maybe you're learning a new skill or switching a job. All of those things, it's energizing. Even writing these books, anybody out there who writes books, it's a love, like, oh, this is great. And then the next thing, you're just losing your mind, but it's such an effort. And then after it gets published, it's still an effort to really just be really happy with everything and how to present it. So that effort is also energizing because it's satisfying and accomplishing it. So those are two really important energies that's in the gratitude book, to see the difference. Because if I'm gossiping, or I'm vengeful, or I'm gaslighting, or I'm blaming everybody for my problems, that's very energizing, but it takes no effort. Zero, boom. Right. And that's very damaging to us. So we want to switch the perspective of like, how am I accountable? What am I doing? What am I doing in myself, with myself, in my own relationship? How am I being harmful? So it's not just about the other person. Where do I show up in this? And then not judge yourself or attack yourself, but be kind to yourself, because we're learning. And this is hard. This is why people don't want help, but it is wonderful. Once you get to that point, it's like, wow, look at what I'm learning. Look at what I can do. No matter how old you are, no matter what you've been through, we can make these small little improvements. And then we're available as role models to other people, which is very, very important in our journey.
Yes. When you have someone who's just starting out, Catherine, what advice would you give them based on your professional experiences? How would you tell them that the first step is still in the right direction and a single step still takes you going forward? Where
Yeah.
do they begin?
I begin with letting them observe actually their breathing.
Really?
Yes. Number one, breathing. Number two, seeing how you treat yourself. So when someone's sitting in my office, or anybody, just watch. Most people are not aware of it when I point it out. And when their anxiety comes up, imagine coming in and you're talking to a professional. Hopefully you're developing a good rapport with that person. And all of a sudden, this is really uncomfortable to talk about, especially to someone that you've just met. And your anxiety is up.
Yeah.
It's just high. Okay. So when the anxiety comes up, the breathing gets shallow. And sometimes it's like you'll see a gasp, but you can actually see them get tight here and here. Again, body language. So if your anxiety is high, we need to regulate that. And we can't regulate anxiety in any way without breathing. So anxiety is directly related to a shallow breath. There's many, many reasons for anxiety. It's just, that's the one we look at first, is getting the breathing. So then what we can do is say, we can give you a breathing exercise. And for the next week or two, before you come into your next appointment, your homework is just to pay attention to your breathing. And you'd be amazing. I mean, we get into a whole session about breath work. What people will come back into their next session, they're like, oh my God, I had no idea. Or they'll come back and say, oh my God, I was breathing. It's not the cure all. It's just not, it fix everything, but it's bringing awareness into yourself and in your body, especially a traumatized person. And that's really scary. So we want to start really slow. Just notice. And I'll do that in a session. I'll say, notice how your breath is shallow right now. And sometimes I'll ask them to take a breath. And I like to focus on the exhale, because the exhale lowers the heart rate. And I'll say, okay, through your mouth. And you'll see somebody go. They just are so don't aware of what the tension is going on in the body. So that's what we do. That's the very, very first thing we do, is we just bring non-judgmental awareness of what's happening in your breathing. That's number one. And then we give you some time with that because that's not scary. We can do it. We can do it at our pace. And then as we move on, our breathing gets better and healthier. We can get deeper into the gut type of breathing, and then all of that starts to change. The next step that we'll jump into is really paying attention to how you talk to yourself, and you'll see it right there. And they'll be putting themselves down. And that actually, when we start to discuss that, people will actually come to tears because it's just so heartbreaking because they don't think that they're worthy or they didn't notice how bad it was. And, that is number two. Those are we go in small steps, always small bites. We don't want to overwhelm anybody at your pace. So those are the main things that we start out with.
So, with all of this wealth of knowledge, let me ask you a personal question. Do you have any kind of specific tradition or a practice that you do to help keep Carl's spirit alive?
Oh, wonderful about Carl was so he died back in 2008. And again, he had brain cancer. He was just such a wonderful man and he was such a hard worker. I remember when he died, the grieving process, I was so mad. I was so mad. Like, how could you believe me? I did everything we could fix. We just couldn't do it. It was stage 4.
I'm so sorry.
And yeah. And I don't think of it that way anymore because, I was mad. I was scared. I was on my own, trying to rebuild myself, ended up in that second relationship to help me out. And he was just a, not a good thing. But, it all worked out in the end. And I ended up back in school and building everything up. But what happens over time is that even with other people in my life that weren't so kind and that have passed on, is you really start to shift into everything they brought into your life. That's all I ever think about with him. I think about like what a kind guy he was, how hard he worked, everything wonderful about him. And those are the stories I tell. That's what you want to keep alive for the next generations. Even with like some of my family members that weren't very kind, they had some, that are no longer alive. They had some really unique things. Like they were gifted cooks. And I'm like, I learned so much. So like I said, there's some things that we can in our memories is just remember the things that we learned and the gifts that we got, no matter how they were.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Catherine. I have to tell you,
Sure.
you smile when talking about Carl. Your eyes smile, your face lights up. Like that's so beautiful. It's so sweet and hearing, and it was just so listening and watching your expressions on your face talk about Carl.
Yeah, that's what we should do is no matter what our memories are, all of the people that have gone before us have made it, no matter how good or bad they are, have made it possible for us to be where we're at. And we get to choose what we want to do with it. We do need help. I don't expect anybody to do this on your own, but that's why it's important to be grateful. And there's some things I am grateful for from my ex that was not nice, that had taught me some things. There are some things that I'm grateful for now that I just go outside and grateful for the weather and to really start to shift perspective and pay attention to yourself and self-observe about whether you're not happy and why is that happening? What are we doing? How are we contributing that? And again, this isn't like a one and done and we can fix our problems. We have to look at this from a bigger picture. What kind of help do we need? What kind of support do we need? And it's step by step. And it can be very overwhelming for some people. And I understand that. So all of us, I know you and myself and anybody who's part of the healing process who have been through some really severe stuff. Again, it's not a competition. It's being able to say, yeah, I get it. I get it. What can I do? How can I help?
Right.
Yeah, be that role model. We need to see people that have survived and thrived and are happy. We need those role models. So thank you for yourself for being one of those role models.
Oh, thank you. Tell everybody where to find your books and where we can find you. I'm going to link everywhere, and then I'm going to ask a favor. So where can we find you?
Well, you can find me at Catherine with a C, Catherine G. cleveland.com, and you can find me. All my social media is Catherine G. Cleveland. Don't forget the G as in Grace. And I'll put the links up to the books. You can find them anywhere that you shop. Mostly I'm an Amazon shopper myself, so we'll put some Amazon links up there. But anywhere you could go, even the library might have it. They can get it because they can go through the library. But the one you can get an ebook, but the one thing these books that I really like about them is that they're in your hand and there's lots of space to write. There's lots of space for artwork, coloring. It gets your brain going.
I
It
love that.
gets like what we're talking about, like going and finding that fire, that light inside, the intuition, all of that work. So I do recommend the hard copy, or the soft cover hard copy, so you can really get intimate. The book should be an intimate experience for you. That
Absolutely.
was the goal. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. It's time for my favorite. Can I ask you to come back and talk with me again?
Oh, I would love to. I would love to come back. The next book, like I said before, is Kinder to Myself. I think that's one of the most important ones. And I would love to come back anytime. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I can't thank you enough. We're going to link everywhere to find Dr. Catherine Cleveland in our show notes. And I am hoping that we have a new relationship and I will have her around and often on. So I thank you for your time this morning and look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you. I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
See, that was easy.
Oh, you were wonderful. Oh my God, that's the best one.